Now, as Canada reviews our own Copyright Act, we thought there was no better time to invite Debora Spar back to reflect on ruling the waves and to share her thoughts on the progress we've made since she first joined us at the Global Forum 10 years ago. Rereading Ruling the Waves today was an eerie experience for me, as it would be for anyone. Her ability to see into the future by understanding our past was extraordinary, and it's actually a lesson for all of us about knowing our history. Ted was right back in 2006. Ruling the Waves should have been required reading. If policymakers had paid more attention to history and less to the outlandish promises of the techno-utopians, we might not be where we are today. I would say it still is required reading, and it has many lessons to teach us. Debora has held positions as the president of Barnard College, Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Development at Harvard's Business School, recently as the president of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, and now she is back at Harvard. So please join me in welcoming to the stage a personal hero of mine, Debora Spar.
That is a more than generous introduction. So I will return the favor with all honesty. As Graham mentioned, I've been going through my own cycles of discovery and chaos. I left Harvard Business School 10 years ago. I spent 9 years as the president of Barnard College, which is one of the remaining 7 sisters all-women's colleges. And so I've been living in the world of women and diversity and inclusion. And kudos to you all for what you're doing. Because it's way too easy for organizations dominated by white men, which is basically every organization, to say we love diversity, but we can't quite get there yet. So to be able to say, as a group of white men, we are going to make ourselves more diverse, and we're going to go out and find the talented women who are there, kudos to all of you. It's a great thing. All right, so it is a great pleasure to be back. It's hard to imagine that 10 years have passed since I last spoke about these issues with this group, but it's really been a wonderful opportunity for me to go back and remind myself of what I said all those years ago, because I've been doing a different gig. So it really was great fun thinking about this. So Graham's already given you much of the story here, but just briefly, I started to write a book about the internet in 1996. And if you'll recall, 1996 in retrospect was sort of the peak of excitement about everything the internet was going to be. And I was at that time in one of those places where the revolution was happening. My students at Harvard Business School were literally founding companies in the hallway and getting funded, and some of them walked away with literally hundreds of millions of dollars before they graduated. Because at that point, kind of every crazy idea was getting backed. So it was a wild and exciting time. But I started to write this book about the political evolution of the political evolution of the internet. And as Graham said, I decided to look at the past, which was sort of a strange decision to make, because just about everybody who was writing about the internet then was looking into the future, predicting how it was going to evolve and how it was going to turn everything that we had ever known topsy-turvy. But I chose to look at the past, not so much at the past of the internet itself, because that's a well-known and not particularly interesting story. Just DARPA created it, it was a military technology, it was to make sure computers could speak securely. People kind of know that. But I set out to tell a much older story, a story that tried to put the internet in the context of all of the other communications revolutions that had come before it. And so I started my story in 1450, which is the year of the Gutenberg press. So not an obvious place to begin a book about a revolutionary technology. But that's where I started it, and a couple of you asked me earlier what I'm working on now. So now I'm writing a book about the connection between our most personal lives and technological evolution, and that book starts in 8000 BC. So I'm just going further and further back. And just to give you the punchline on that, that one's arguing that monogamy as we know it was a creation of the plow. So hold that thought, and I'll come back in another 10 years and tell you how that worked out. And the thesis, as one of my students said, is that, yes, and it will be destroyed by Tinder. So that's the next book. But the reason I went back to 1450 was, as again Graham mentioned, to try to look at how these cycles of technology evolved over time. And I don't believe that history repeats itself. There's no reason why it should, but I do think you can learn from these patterns. And so by looking at the printing press, and then the telegraph, and then the radio, and then satellite television, I ultimately argued that all of these technologies went through 4 fairly predictable phases of evolution. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to go through these briefly. But the first cycle, I argued, and the one that we were witnessing in the crazy 1990s, was the cycle marked by innovation. This is kind of the sexiest part of the evolution. This is when brilliant young people are creating things. This is the eureka moment. It's when people are in their garages or in their labs or their parents' basements or wherever they are, and they come up with something new, something that's truly revolutionary. And the world begins to get ideas of how this technology is going to change everything. At this point in time, there is no commerce to speak of, because the people who are creating, almost always, these really breakthrough technologies, they're not doing it for commercial reasons. They just have a different brain setup. They're creating things because they are creators. So there's no property rights, there's no rules of business during this time, because you don't need them. These are just inventions. Next phase. Next phase draws a different group of brilliant, pioneering people. But these are the people who are now looking at these new technologies and thinking about how they might make money from them. Occasionally, they're the same people. I would put Bill Gates in that category, someone who both kind of created the technology, although he actually stole it, and we'll come back to that, but sort of refined the technology and then saw the commercial possibilities. But more often, they're folks like Mark Zuckerberg, who wasn't a technology person, but saw the technology and was brilliant in thinking about how you build a business on top of it. During this phase, again, there are no rules because nobody wants them. So the pioneers, as I call them, let's say the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Bill Gates, they have no interest in rules because they are trying to build a market where none existed before. Governments might have some vague inkling of a desire for rules, but they have no idea how to create them. Because how can you create rules for something that hasn't existed before? And there's a great quote, and I should have written it down because I won't get it quite right, but when the US Congress was trying to figure out how to regulate radio in the 1920s, they were just gobsmacked by it. They had no idea how to do it. And they said, how can man create rules for the heavens? How could you think about rules for something that was invisible above your head? Now, of course, we think about radio regulation as, the easiest thing in the world to conceive of, but it wasn't easy to conceive of in 1922, and so it doesn't happen. So what happens during the second phase, at least I call it, you get this commingling of pioneers and pirates. They're the folks who are trying to build, quote, legitimate businesses, and they're, quote, who are just trying to steal, folks who are trying to steal as much as they can. And at that point in time, you can't really tell the difference. Because what was Mark Zuckerberg? Was he a pirate or a pioneer? What was Bill Gates? What was Sean Fanning? Pirate or pioneer? You can't tell because there's no rules that differentiate between them. And I go, when I talk about this in the book, I also look at the actual pirates of the high seas in the 15th century, and they went back and forth all the time too. So when you were a really successful pirate, you were knighted by the Queen. Again, some interesting similarities. Let's see who's visiting the White House these days. The third phase is what I call creative anarchy. And that was the phase that you all lived through, suffered through in the late 1990s into the early 2000s. And what happens then is that sort of the needle, if you will, starts to move. And suddenly, what was so much fun in the first and second phases, this new crazy Wild West, is no longer quite so much fun. And there are demands for rules start to emerge. And they typically come from two different sources. On the one hand, they come from consumers and from, if you will, ordinary people who, yeah, maybe the internet is fun, but they're a little bit worried about their credit card data being stolen or their kid watching too much porn. Those are somewhat, easy to imagine. The more interesting demand for rules comes from the most successful pioneers. Because once the pioneers have created successful businesses, that's the point at which they want rules. Because they got all the territory, they got all the property, now they want property rights. And again, the best example of this is Bill Gates. Bill Gates took DOS from Dartmouth University. It had been created by a bunch of Dartmouth professors, and it was called shareware. There was no software in the 1970s. It was called shareware. But once Gates shared it and built a business on it, then he wants property rights in software. Look at what's happening to Facebook right now. They're all of a sudden spending a lot of time in Washington. Look at what's going to happen to Uber 3, 4, 5 years from now. Once you create the market, you want rules to cement your ownership and to create stability. Because, as you all know, you cannot run a business without some measure of stability. So once the third stage happens, the fourth stage of rule creation follows quite naturally. Because, and again, you're just both describing it. Once businesses sort of agree on what kind of rules they need, governments are pretty good at providing them. They may not have been able to imagine them in the earlier stages, but they can provide them pretty easily. So that's how the cycles move around. So it is tempting, not to mention deeply annoying, for any author to say, "I told you so." But I think I got this one right. And it is one of the deep sorrows of my life, although the world is dealing with infinitely bigger sorrows. This book came out on September 12th, 2001. Nobody read it. The world was falling apart. So one of these days, if I can ever find time, I would actually like to reissue it, and, without too much patting on oneself on the back. But I think what you see, what's happened, particularly in the music industry, is that the cycles have played out pretty closely to what we had imagined back in 2001. So I'll go through this very quickly because you all lived this. In the 80s and early 90s, new technologies emerged that made music digital and created new ways of listening to it. This was the innovation phase. It was exciting, it was fun, until it wasn't anymore. So you moved pretty quickly from the innovation into the creative anarchy phase, where some of the most interesting people in the world, that's why I think this industry was so compelling, they were the Sean Fannings and the folks who created Napster and the folks who created all the companies whose names no longer exist. But these were people figuring out how you delivered music in completely different ways, breaking up the album, breaking up the idea was you were going to kill the record labels, of course. And some of my favorites from this time, people like Chuck D, who really became sort of an evangelical for this movement, just one of many quotes you could give. This is the beginning, prophesied Chuck D, of the end of domination. Every newspaper article from the time that described the record labels calls them dinosaurs. Dinosaurs in cement, dinosaurs in concrete, dinosaurs in sand, but dinosaurs across the board. But then what happens? Between 1999 and 2004, 2005, you go from the second phase to the third phase, where there starts to be a reasonable and a loud and a persistent demand for rules. I won't give you all the numbers here, but you know them. By 1998, there were 26,000 illicit music sites. Numbers, numbers, numbers. But what was happening amidst all this activity was that nobody was making money. The labels weren't making money, but also the artists weren't making money, and the pirates weren't making money. Sean Fanning raised a lot of money, but he wasn't making a lot of money. And so what happens, again, predictably, is that the pioneers, the ones who are most successful in creating new business models, begin to advocate for rules. The big technological shift, of course, was I think, really led by Apple and iTunes, with Spotify and Pandora coming close on their heels. And it was not so much actually not at all, taking the old model and just putting new rights around it. It was using the technology to change the way people listen to music and to give people options, which I think iTunes did most powerfully at first, of having a different kind of experience. So I'll do the worst thing for any author to do. I'll use my own children as examples. So my kids were downloading like crazy. You know, every Pirates Bay, whatever, everything was being stolen. I'm running a college. I'm like, you can't do this because it's my bandwidth here. But once you could get iTunes, once you could get Spotify, once you could get music in ways that felt different and felt sexy and that you could control, people were willing to pay for it. They were particularly willing to pay for it when it became mobile. So you weren't just linked to your desktop anymore. You could take your music with you. And someone was just telling me, walked down every street in New York, everyone's listening to music. I mean, they're getting killed because they're walking into traffic because they're listening to music. But that was the compelling proposition. And so once this shift occurred, and once people like Prince is sort of may he rest in peace is the case here. Prince was another evangelist for web-based distribution until people started distributing his music around him, and then he turned around and sued his fan sites. So you just saw this shift playing out, but once this shift does play out, the music industry fell into line quite quickly. It began to create the rules and go to government and ask government to uphold them. I have numbers. I won't read them to you because, again, you live them and you know them, but you can see the shift in all of your data. As physical sales are declining, streams come up, and slowly, I think, profits are starting to come back. They're in a different form, but they're starting to come back. So where we are right now, I would say, is that the artists have joined the labels in becoming fierce advocates for property rights, demanding, as well they should, that A, the music industry needs to pay the artists in whatever form or channels they develop for the artist's creative content, and B, that the government needs to play its role in enforcing these payment systems. I just want to stop there for a second because this is a really big deal. The big deal is what's happened to the underlying philosophy. During the moment of creative anarchy, the philosophy was that all music should be free. That's gone now. We are now back, if you will, to the old philosophy, which says music can't be free. It must be paid for and it must be monetized. Whether it's monetized by subscription or advertising doesn't really make a difference. It's the underlying philosophy that is so important. Property rights in music have been reestablished. The dollar figures are not huge, but the philosophy is there. So those of you, particularly those of you who are artists, I'm sure you worry a lot about the dollar figures. I sympathize. From the academic perspective, the dollars are less important than the philosophy. And the philosophy is that the property rights are back. Again, you know what's happening with the rules right now. I won't repeat them, but at the international level, the EU level, the Canadian level, and even the American level, we have gotten rules and laws passed. And it's worth spending just a second on what happened in my country on Friday last week, where Kanye West and Donald Trump had this, this thing in the White House, and this legislation was passed with fanfare. But what's really interesting about that is not who was in the White House. It was the fact that at the time when the United States is in its most polarized state I have ever seen, this was a completely bipartisan piece of legislation. Everyone now agrees on the importance of property rights in music. So, what happens from here? For better or worse, less excitement. Digital music already has become, I would argue, just music. My kids, like yours, will never buy a CD, and they buy vinyl as wall adornments, because it's really cool to have records on your walls of your apartment. Over the next few years, the channels and the formats are almost certainly going to change again. I don't know how they will change. I can't predict that. But I think Alexa or Alexa-like equivalents will play a huge role in this. And you can just imagine, Alexa already knows what I'm doing. She knows what I'm listening to. She knows what I don't like. She knows what I'm cooking for dinner. She will put that together in some way that I can't imagine. But the artist will get paid because that basic system has been established. The record labels haven't been dismantled for better or worse, and the artists haven't been able to claim a meaningful larger chunk of the industry that one could argue is rightfully theirs. But those sorts of changes rarely happen, even during revolutionary time. So in the end, therefore, or the end as we are right now, the online music industry will likely be regulated once again by a combination of private and public forces. Firms will set industry standards, governments will enforce them, and even die-hard music fans, and I would argue especially die-hard music fans, will accept the notion of property rights in a digital age. This isn't the future that Chuck D touted, of course. It isn't a world where music is free and artists are rich and record labels fade into commercial oblivion. It is, however, a world that aligns with what the political history of technology suggests, and that is that markets need rules if they are to survive, and power flows slowly sometimes, ironically perhaps, and often unfairly to those who make the rules. I will stop there. Thank you very much.